Welcome back to Cumberland Strategies Women in Politics Speaker Series. Last week, my colleague Mackenzie Taylor and I had the opportunity to sit down with Linda Reid, the former Speaker for the British Columbia Legislative Assembly. Together with Linda, we discussed the Universal Childcare Program, and Linda had the opportunity to reflect on some of her experiences as the minister responsible for early childhood education in British Columbia. I hope you enjoy the episode.
Welcome to our Women in Politics speaker series. We're very fortunate and very excited to have you on. We have about 8 questions for you, kind of an overview of your experience in politics, what motivated you to get involved, and any wisdom that you can impart to any women considering either working or running for a political position. I think that every one of our speaker series always starts off with, giving us a brief overview of who you are and why you decided to run in politics.
I was a teacher and a school administrator when I was contemplating the landscape, who actually made the decisions that affected learners in our province. And I was getting all these binders from Victoria, you should do this with your students and this with your teachers. And I thought, oh my goodness, I want to be closer to those who made those kinds of decisions. So my teacher colleague said to me, well, you should run. Well, my riding then was held by Bill Vander Zalm, the current premier of the province back in the day. And so the party said to me, well, you should probably choose a different riding. You don't want to be cannon fodder as you're going down that road and your first time out. But the reality was, I truly believe to this day that you want to be able to live where you represent and represent where you live. I think there has to be a constituent connection as you go forward. I think that's vitally important.
I would agree. For how many years? Oh, sorry.
My passion was always about education. That led me to a whole array of different early learning portfolios on a go forward basis.
How many years were you teaching before you decided to run?
Almost a dozen years. I taught in the Vancouver School District for a year and then the Richmond School District for 11 years.
Oh my goodness, wow. That must have been a huge transition then, going from that to running and then actually being elected.
It was quite the moment in time, I can tell you. The district, I probably wasn't convinced I would win. I don't know if anybody was convinced I would win going up against the premier of the province. So they didn't hire a replacement for me. So I was elected in October of 1991, and I stayed in my school, managing my school district until basically early January that same year. And it was fascinating, truly fascinating, moving back and forth and around. But we managed to do it. We got it all done, and the kids actually think I think the students in my programs had some great experiences as a result.
I can imagine. I can't believe that they didn't hire a replacement. They
thought they were lucky. They were lucky. That was back in the day when it was difficult to find qualified teachers. That's certainly not the case today. We have lots more folks entering education today.
Yeah, we do. It's amazing to see the progress. Were you the first, just correct me if I'm wrong, were you the first female to assume the nomination and run in your riding? Or were there others before you?
I actually think I was the first female.
Amazing.
It was, as you know, back in the day, in the 80s, the 80s and the 90s, politics was very much a male-dominated profession in British Columbia. And it was older gentlemen. Most folks in that day, in that time, came to politics after they'd left a career of some 30 or 40 years. So most politicians were male, most were Caucasian, most were in their 60s. And that, frankly, is not representative of any community in British Columbia. And I've always believed we need to do our utmost to have diversity. So I wanted to see more women elected, more people of color elected. We had such a narrow view of the world back then. And I think politics is about vantage point. You have to occupy those vantage points to make the best law in terms of how it affects everyone who lives in your community, not just a select group in your community.
Yeah, representative politics. Hannah, did you have a question?
Yes, you said you ran against the premier of BC at the time. What made your campaign so successful? I mean, they didn't find a replacement for you. What made you or your campaign team turn around the boat and brought you to victory and being elected for 28 years?
I think, frankly, you get the vote of every hand you shake. So we worked for a good solid 2 years. We started campaigning in 1989. The election wasn't until October of 1991. So I knocked on people's doors sometimes 2 and 3 times, asking for their support. And there was turmoil in British Columbia politics, no question. By the time the election actually rolled around, Bill Vander Zalm was not the candidate. He had had some issues that around the sale of Fantasy Gardens, and we moved him from the process with less than 2 weeks to go. So it was a tumultuous time in BC politics, but I truly believe and continue to believe to this day that you get the vote of every hand you shake. The constituency work is vitally important. Once you're elected, people don't mind which party you represent. They have an issue, they want someone to help them solve it, something to help them navigate through government, somebody to figure out how the process works for them. And I truly believe that that's the most important work you can do as a member of the Legislative Assembly, is to serve your constituents. And I've held on to that view for 29 years.
That's amazing, because you are, correct me if I'm wrong, again, the longest standing MLA in British Columbia, correct?
Longest serving woman MLA in British Columbia.
Wow.
There were some lovely older gentlemen back in the 20s and 30s who served for more years, but it was a vastly different job then. They would come to Victoria, a few times a year, but they certainly were elected longer than I.
What, looking back on your career in politics, what is something that you are the most proud of, or even a myriad of accomplishments that you're the most proud of? And what were some challenges that you overcame during that time?
Again, I love the constituency work. I think that's vitally important. One of the cabinet portfolios I held was Minister responsible for early childhood development. And I can't tell you that to this day, that gives me huge joy. It's generational work. If we want a stronger community, it will only be because, and a stronger province, it will only be because we have effectively resourced young children and their families. Hugely important. And to be able to do that work on a whole array of different programs in terms of supports through Children's Hospital, community supports, how we actually were helpful to families so they could parent their children more effectively. That work still stands out to me. Another piece of work that connects me to my previous life was dealing with children with autism. Those are the kids I dealt with in the Richmond School District. And the notion of putting in place an individualized funding program for those very same families continues to speak to me. Prior to my coming into the role, it was if 9 other kids in your neighborhood moved in, we'd fund a program for 10 kids. But if there weren't 10 kids with autism in your neighborhood, well, unfortunately, but you didn't get very much support. To individualize that funding and allow families to make those choices and to hire the occupational therapist, the physical therapist, the speech language clinician, those things made a dramatic, huge, impactful impression on BC families. Intensely proud of that work. And I can tell you today that work continues to warm my heart.
I know that Hannah has some questions about the early childhood development, actually.
Yeah, so recently the Government of Canada announced $10 a day childcare program. And from your experience as the minister responsible for early childhood development and childcare, can you tell us and dive in a bit more about the programs you offered and how you serviced families with varying needs and expectations?
It's always important to support families. There's no question. And the notion that we looked at early childhood development, no question, we looked at supported child development, because not every child can operate independently in a child care setting. Sometimes they needed additional supports, whether they had speech language issues, whether they had autism, whether they had a whole array of other challenges before them. So it's not just that the child care space needs to be funded, the support staff around serving that child care space and serving that child need to be funded as well. Some of that work we put in place, and again, intensely proud of that work, as families deserve that level of support. And if you want a stronger province, it's because you effectively resource young children in terms of how they're going to parent their own children one day. It speaks to the work that being generational. We want stronger parenting practice. We want stronger families. And we do that by investing in families. So I'm truly delighted with the work that's continuing today.
Mm-hmm. And you said before you entered your portfolio, if there weren't per se 10 children in your neighborhood that had autism, there wouldn't be any services for them. Can you discuss some of the policy solutions you brought to these rural and remote communities to deliver appropriate care?
Most definitely. We put in place individualized funding. So we put the dollars, the purchasing power in the hands of moms and dads of the children's families to look for those services and to purchase those services directly. Because there's opportunity birth to 6 that you don't see again in the lifetime of a child. That's when the brain has the most plasticity. That's the greatest response time. You want to intervene as quickly as you can and as effectively as you can with children in our province, and to ensure the families have the ability to put those dollars to good use and hire the services that matter to their child, frankly matter to their family. Spoke to me then, continues to speak to me today. It's really, really good work.
So, just to dive in a bit deeper, um, in 2005, Prime Minister Paul Martin negotiated a universal childcare program with BC, and we're seeing that happen again. Can you just talk a little bit about your experience negotiating that agreement? And how did BC plan on implementing it? You just discussed a little bit about allowing families to choose for themselves. So, how would that change if that plan did come to fruition?
I was actually at those meetings back in the day, and that was it was an amazing piece of work. It didn't actually result in the outcomes everyone wished for. And sometimes it takes a bit of time to get it right. I'm hoping this time, this round of federal negotiation actually delivers that on the ground. I mean, there are pockets of excellence across the province and across the country. What we want to do is sustain it, make it sustainable for all kids in our province. I mean, in British Columbia, there's probably roughly 40,000 babies born each year. There's ample opportunity to do some really, really good work. And is to align all the resources, federal, provincial, municipal, it's really important. But all those elections are not aligned necessarily. So sometimes something is almost at the edge of getting approved, and there's an election call and something changes. There's an election call provincially and something changes. There's an election call municipally. And the people say, well, why is municipal important? Well, they're the zoning bylaw folks. So they determine where those childcare centers are situated and how they operate. So all the pieces of the puzzle have to interlink so very effectively to create long-term sustainability. What you're looking for when you support families is sustainability. Things have to last. Parents have to be able to count on a process and a delivery system so that it makes sense for their family. It can't be hit and miss. It has to be sustainable. So again, sometimes it takes some time to get that right, but it's absolutely worth doing and doing well.
And building off of that, how did you build political will for your programs that you implemented to make sure they remained in place?
I think women particularly are very talented when it comes to building networks, building relationships. And I've always believed you need a friend in every corner of the house. There has to be cross-party cooperation, consolidation of ideas. And the notion that women can stand together more effectively always is an opportunity for me. Anything I can do to see more women elected, anything I can do to engage the dialogue, anything I can do to cement those foundational pieces, really, really important. Women challenge themselves and making a myriad of decisions every day and are frankly talented at it. They're good at it. So the notion that we can build some momentum by getting more women on side, more women pushing for them what matters to families is a huge undertaking, but is absolutely worthy of consideration and worthy of doing. We've had some great momentum in our province over the last decade, and we will again. We'll rebuild some of those bridges and get some of that work happening again.
Very good. And what are your thoughts on the recent deal between the Government of Canada and the province of BC on universal childcare?
Oh, I think there are always positive steps. Anytime you can get any level of government working effectively with any other level of government, it's always a good decision. It's always a positive step.
Well, that's wonderful. Mackenzie, do you have any questions?
I do. So going back to the idea of getting more women in politics, and I know, just from even seeing your social media engagement, you are a champion for women, especially within the sphere. And I'm wondering if you could provide some insight into how the workplace culture from when you entered politics to when you retired, especially for women, how it changed or did it remain stagnant? And what were some of those changes?
Oh, there's some peaks and valleys. There are times that I'm intensely proud of our country. And then there are times that I'm just struck by how negative we can be towards other women in elected office. There was a time in the last number of years where there were 6 of the 10 provinces had female leaders, had female premiers. And it's definitely peaks and valleys. And I can tell you from my experience, the things that people will say to a female politician are dramatically different than what they'll say to a male counterpart. So we've got some distance to travel before we rest on this question. It shouldn't be that we are so fiercely harsh based on someone's gender, as opposed to based on their ideas and their ability to mobilize those ideas. I want to see more balance when it comes to the political commentary. And I want to see us move away from the gender politics of, frankly, being so disrespectful to women politicians, which for some people has become sport. I mean, some people across this country have engaged in such diatribe that is just unhealthy and so very disrespectful. We can do much better. And I think having more women in the discussion, more women who are prepared to step up and put their name on the ballot, hugely important. Betsy McGregor wrote a book called Women on the Ballot. If you've not seen it, pick it up. It's about all kinds of about 300 plus women she's interviewed across the country on their experiences. And the things that they've battled, the things that they put to rest are just unnecessary obstacles to the process, things that no one should be asked to do. When you're auditioning, when you run for public office, you're auditioning for a job. It's the biggest job interview in the world is a public election. But the folks who set out to make it just untenable, really, what have they accomplished other than to dissuade some of the best people from seeking public office, which should not be, which in our country today should not be the goal.
Well, as a female speaker, do you think that the discourse in the chamber compared to when you were there, perhaps versus a predecessor, a male predecessor, do you think that was different? Or do you think that there was a certain level of dialogue because you were a female in that role in the chamber?
It's a great question. And each day in the British Columbia legislature, and probably any legislature in the country, is a different day. But the notion that we've only had 4 female speakers over the history of our province, and 2 of them only served for a little over 2 years. I'm one of the ones that actually served for 4 years. I think I'm the only one of the 4 that served for an entire 4-year term. There has to be ways for us to be more respectful of the process and of the institution. I had, I think, high regard for my colleagues. I don't think that the process was undermined during my time in the chair. I think the process was well supported. But I'd also been there such a long time that I had some decent regard for my colleagues. It's a challenge to folks who believe that there are many jobs still in this life that women should not entertain. I don't abide by that notion. I have a daughter who's 21. I want her to have so many more choices on a go-forward basis than many of her colleagues and her peers have experienced in the past. I mean, I remember thinking, oh my goodness, how long before we get to the year 2000? My daughter was born in the year 2000. The notion that we're still battling some of the same battles from 20 years, 40 years ago is daunting, but not insurmountable. As long as we pull together and continue to respect each other, I think women can make a dramatic impact on the process.
I do too. I really think that it comes down to women supporting other women and seeing that through. Do you think your daughter will ever run for politics?
She has asked that routinely, and she's keeping her options open.
Yeah, that's a great political response. Hannah, do you have a question?
Yes, I was wondering if you can provide some insight on how workplace culture for women was like when you entered politics in 1991 and how it was different upon retiring in 2019.
One of the pieces of work that I really wanted was to humanize the buildings. The buildings were very much a male-dominated place. And again, I mentioned earlier that the average age of the legislature was probably 60 or 65 when I was first elected. The average age of the legislature today is probably mid-40s. So we've picked up at least a generation's viewpoint. If you think of generations sort of being 15 to 20 years in duration. So we have a younger, more diverse electorate, and we have a younger, more diverse legislature today. We certainly have more diversity elected. We certainly have, I think, some very skillful parliamentarians who understand the rules of the place and want to make the place a more effective institution. There's always room for improvement, and every legislature will set its own tone and set its own pace. But as long as that pace is embedded in respect and regard, because at the end of the day, you're creating law for every British Columbian. How it impacts their life should be uppermost in your mind, should be top of mind. And how they manage to accomplish a volume of work is based on the relationships you have in the chamber. Back in the day when the sides were so unevenly matched, when there was, 50 or 60 of one party and 10 or 12 of another party, problematic. There has to be some balance. There has to be a decent sized opposition, I believe, because the party system that needs to have collaboration to work, needs to have intensity to work. People talk about question period and say, oh my goodness, it's out of control most days. For me, and certainly in my role as speaker, I saw it as taking the lid off the pressure cooker for 30 minutes a day and allowing the intensity of emotion to carry the debate. I mean, people who are bland about everything, who don't care about the issues, rarely seek public office. People come because they're passionate about something. The notion that they get to advance those views in passionate ways during a question period exercise each day doesn't take away from the fact that immediately following the question period, they settle back down to parliamentary debate and go into, line by line consideration of a particular bill. Shall section 1 pass? And may debate that issue for 10 or 20 hours. I mean, the notion that the question period highlights the issues, the sustainability of still getting the work done matters, and women can actually assist in building a very respectful, engaged workforce within and outside the legislature. I think that's really important.
Thank you so much for that. And I definitely agree with you. We definitely need more work on both sides of the aisles. And I feel like politics is getting more alienated every day.
We really do. But it's interesting, I worked in government for 3 years. And even from that period to now, like the influx of female staffers, and not only female staffers, but people who are chief of staff, director of policy, director of communications. And I think that sometimes we so narrowly think about women in politics as, running, but, it's incredible the work that female staffers alone are doing, because they're moving the pendulum forward, that, you don't have to just be working in an office, but you can get, a pretty senior role that, influences outcomes, and working closely with decision makers is like definitely another perspective. And it's incredible to see some of my former colleagues really doing great work within political ecosphere. And sometimes talking, and especially throughout the internship program, and having Hannah on board, we talk a lot about advice to people who are looking to get into politics, because so often there is the narrative that is sometimes true, this is an old boys club, sexism, you're not going to get anywhere unless you know somebody or XYZ. What kind of advice would you bestow to anyone who is looking to get into politics, whether elected or working?
Excellent comments. Excellent comments. I certainly spend lots of time recruiting people to run for public office, and I always said to them, know what you want to do the day after the election. People say, well, I want to be elected. That's excellent for day one. What do you want to do the next day? If you have a clear path you want to achieve, it creates a sense of positive outlook, if you will, because there's so many distractions. There's so many ways to be derailed in Victoria and in Ottawa, across the country. But if you keep your perspective fixed on whatever it is that you want to achieve, and for me, it was a better education system. I wanted a stronger education system for vulnerable learners in our province. From day one to the day I left public office, I kept my eye on that ball. If people are prepared to focus on what it is they want to achieve, they'll have a much more productive time in politics. In fact, a much more rewarding, enriching time in politics. Because people, this is not a job for the faint of heart. People want to know they made some kind of contribution, because you're away from your family for extended periods of time. Your social time is almost minimal. You're disconnected from so many times and places and events that your colleagues would want you to come to from your previous lives. I mean, the focus is pretty much 99% the capital, whatever country or province you're in. It's the capital that dictates so much of the activity. But if you have a sense of focus, know what it is you want to achieve, you get a tremendous sense of satisfaction. There is no better work, I feel, than public service. Giving back, helping out another human being to achieve something that's important to them, speaks to me and will always speak to me. People seek out help from their politicians because they need some assistance in some regard, whether it's access to a health procedure, whether it's an ICBC issue. No matter what it is, people want to know that someone's in their corner. I always wanted to be that MLA that they could count on that was in their corner. And I think that's a huge lesson we can impart to everybody who seeks public office. If you don't enjoy meeting people and helping people, it's not likely the position for you.
I really appreciate that point. That is a very good point. We hear a lot of different advice, but I think that really speaks to the tone and the epitome of what a very good politician is. And even though you're now retired, I think you are doing a public service, and you are continuing to do that by making sure that the right people are in the right roles. And I would like to thank you for doing that, because you really are moving the pendulum forward, and you are an example of what other women can reference when they are moving toward that goal. Something that's kind of fun to ask is, who is your favorite female politician globally, and why?
When I was first elected in 1991, I had 3 women phone me up on election night And it was just such a glorious moment in time. There was Sheila Copps from Ottawa who phoned up, and she'd actually come and door knocked with me a little bit in Richmond, which I thought was just a tremendous opportunity for me. Grace McCarthy phoned me up, who had been a longtime member and member of the Social Credit Party in British Columbia, and was the best, probably to this date, the best minister the province had ever seen when it came to branding British Columbia. She was amazing at that work. And Pat Carney, who just retired as a member of the Senate of Canada. All of them strong-willed, fierce women who, for me, I was so very touched because they took the time to pick up the phone and leave me a message, to call me. It was tremendously impactful to me that people would do that. And I've tried to move that agenda item forward ever since, because I think it's really important that you take the time and to acknowledge the contributions that people make. Grace McCarthy was wondering that I seemed like such a nice girl. What was I doing in politics? That was almost 30. That was more than 30 years ago now. And I stayed in touch with her, and when she went on to do some very fine work in terms of supporting children's charities and I helped her with that. I mean, the connections you make as women tend to be steadfast. We tend to stand well together. We just need to broaden that appeal and broaden that outreach, because at the end of the day, we all want, I think it's a similar outcome. We want to live in a province that better supports its residents, its citizens. And how we achieve those ends definitely require cooperation, definitely require collaboration. But the notion that we have to stand by women is hugely important to me. I'm going to continue that work.
Well, we thank you, and anything that we can do while you do continue that work, we are more than happy to do, because we're stronger together. But it's true. It's funny. So I'm originally from New Brunswick, and I think that sometimes my friends in Ontario have this very preconceived idea that it really is all male within the legislature, which isn't necessarily true for this government. You know, there's a lot of female ministers, and they said, really? And I said, yes, you know, people can be more progressive than they once were. It's possible for mindsets and attitudes to change. And it just takes showing people the right example, and not necessarily just pointing to gender, but to competency, and showing that you can move and do things effectively despite your gender. It's quite powerful. And I'm very proud of it, you know, as a New Brunswicker, to be able to point to it and say, you know, no, they're not all men. There are a lot of strong women from like agriculture to business who are in the legislature. So it's very exciting to see.